Welcome to the Wall Street Lab podcast, where we interview top financial professionals and deconstruct their practices to give you an insider look into the world of finance.
Hello and welcome to the Wall Street Lab podcast, episode 50. Today we are having a small celebration of our 50th episode. We are sitting all together here. My name is Luke. We have Andy and Leo. Say hello, guys.
Hi, everyone. I should point out that we're not sitting together. We are sitting in different locations as we are living through very interesting times now. But Luke and Andy live in the same apartment, so they are almost sitting in the same place. So
full compliance and in different rooms.
I'm glad that you made that one clear.
Yes. To tell you guys what's going on, we've decided to make a special episode this week to have a small celebration of the 50th episode with us, because we've been receiving a lot of emails, a lot of messages from you listeners that you would like to find out maybe a little bit more about our backgrounds, how the podcast was founded, what are the plans. So this is what we're going to do. It's going to be a very free-flowing format. We're going to talk a little bit about our founding story of the podcast. We're going to talk about our favorite episodes, some books and other podcast recommendations, as well as other resources that might be useful for you. Yeah, so let's get it going.
And we're also going to have some wine. That's very important because after all, we are celebrating.
Yes, so you're going to have wine. I'm still unfortunately stuck on coffee, but
Luke is drinking kombucha.
I think that's a perfect segue into why are you still drinking coffee while we are drinking wine?
Yeah, I have to study, which sounds might sound weird, but we might get into further background things. But maybe we can start off with Leo. I love you telling the story of the beginning of the podcast. So how this all came together. Why don't you jump in? Tell everyone what was the major factor in your decision to start this podcast?
So Luke and I, as most of you probably know, we studied together. We did our masters together in Frankfurt from 2014 to 16. So I think it was about 2015 when we started playing with the idea of creating our own podcast, because we used to exchange notes about what podcasts we like, and we realized that we both enjoyed just listening to different people. We had a lot of interests in common. Thought, hey, why don't we try this one out? And we're still in school, and what a great way to ask smart people that are in positions of power, people that know a lot about what we want to learn about, without sounding weird. That was really the genesis of the podcast. So our first episode was with a professor at Frankfurt School, and that was very interesting. Our second episode was with our former boss, and our third episode was with someone that also worked at the firm we used to work at the time. So the first three was easy, but then after that, I think things started to develop, and then look at where we are now. We're in episode 50. I'm glad that we started it. And then, of course, I would be remiss to say Andy joined at a critical moment in time. And I think if it wouldn't be for Andy, we would probably not be here today, because he's the one that puts in most of the hard work and continues to bring a lot of very interesting guests. Andy, let me ask you this. So you were a listener, and now you're a part of the podcast. Number one, what got you interested in listening, and what has it been like for you to now be hosting this together with us?
I can answer the first question with one word, and that's Luke. A couple of years ago, I moved into the same apartment as Luke, and that hasn't changed since. He was like, I'm doing this podcast thing, and I'm like, what's a podcast? And he's like, well, just listen to it. I'm like, okay, I like finance, and I've been in finance myself. Then I started listening to it. I was like, oh, it's really cool. I have this guest, and you should all interview them. And Luke was like, honestly, I'm kind of busy. Why don't you do it yourself? And I was like, hey, well, why not? I like the idea of just like going to random people that I really admire and be like, hey, do you want to spend an hour talking to me and giving me all your advice for free? And that's what I stuck with. So, and it's been a great fun. I don't think anybody of the people I interviewed would even spend a moment with me if it wouldn't be for the podcast. So thanks, guys, for taking me in. It's been a big pleasure.
I think, Andy, you've been, for those of you who have been following us from the very beginning, you are probably very familiar with our long summer breaks that we've been doing between season 1, 2, and 3. And when Andy came in, suddenly season 3 turned into never-ending season, pretty much. So Andy has been responsible for our continued releasing of episodes, which is awesome.
Sorry, Luke, to interrupt you, but let me put you on the spot here. You released one episode yesterday, the day before. No, yesterday. Yeah. Should we expect to hear more from you going forward?
Definitely. I have great plans. How the plans work out, we'll obviously have to see, as with everything in life. But yeah, the plan is there. So don't worry. I think we can also tell you a little bit at the end about what we have planned, because with all of the episodes you guys have pre-recorded, it's going to be tough for me to fit in. But I'm sure I'll find a spot. I would also like to mention the fun story, I think, from the very beginning that I enjoy telling the most from the very start, from the first episode that we did with Simon Hurst, the first one that we were scrambling to put together when we came up with the idea of the podcast, when we were very surprised when Simon said yes to us just to record an episode for a non-existent at that time podcast, and then that when he said yes, and when he said I have time tomorrow before I fly somewhere else, when Leo ran to the store to get the microphones, and I was working on some recording software and then editing software to make sure that we can put this together properly. I think that was like a very defining moment in the story of the Wall Street Lab.
Yeah, I remember running to the store and not knowing what type of recorder I should get, what type of microphone I should get, but I think at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter which one it is. We had an interview, so that's the start. I'm glad that happened that way.
Yes, me too.
I'm actually grateful that I didn't have to go through all this. Probably one of the reasons I could enjoy making episodes and turning our season 3 into the endless story is because you guys did already all the hard work beforehand. So I only had to sit in the nest that already was made for me. So thank you guys for that.
It took us a while to figure out all of the processes, but Andy was also very much responsible for optimizing all of everything. So everything from editing episodes, which we no longer do by ourselves, but rather have someone edit it, and it's a massive time saving, so we can have more episodes and focus on recording and getting more guests that you as the listeners might enjoy. And on that point, I think it's also important to mention that we are working really hard. Each of us has a daily job that we work in. The podcast has been something we've been doing just completely on the side as something that we just enjoy doing. And we are doing our best to communicate with everyone. We are doing our best to respond to every email that we are getting, but sometimes it's just not possible. So we'd like to ask for your understanding. We'll try to do a better job moving forward. Also, if you would like to reach out to us, I think that the best medium is LinkedIn. Just please write us that you come from the podcast, so we know that, because we also get a lot of different requests there. So with that in mind, maybe we can jump into what we mentioned in the beginning, the favorite episodes. Each of us took a long look at what we've done before, and each of us has prepared a few episodes we particularly enjoyed, so you can also go back and re-listen to the ones that might be really interesting to you.
Maybe just a little bit of background why we thought this would be interesting, because it turns out that we have 3 people hosting the episode, and sometimes I have friends and colleagues ask me, so, you have a podcast, I didn't know that, so what should I listen to? And I always try to give them some guidance. So now we're in episode 50, so we have the luxury of having many episodes recorded. So for those of you who are listening to us for the first time, maybe this will be helpful to maybe at least point you to the right direction, or at least a few episodes that you can start with.
Leo, jump in. Go ahead. Let's hear it.
Oh, okay. Let me also do another disclosure. If you are a former guest in the podcast and your name is not listed here, please no hard feelings. I think we could spend hours talking about each individual interview that we've had, but we decided to keep it short, just in the interest of time. So here we go. Number 1, and for me, is number 16 with Carl Richards. That was a great episode. We talk about the business of being a financial advisor and how Carl has spent so much time focusing on turning complexity into simplicity. He has written a book called The Behavior Gap, and we spent a lot of time talking about that. He has his very well-known sketches online on LinkedIn, so that was a great pleasure for me to do. The second one I have is with Markus Stor, which is episode number 3. And Markus is, I don't know what his official title today is, but I think he's responsible for alternative investments at Ferry Trust, Luke and I's former employer. And he's a very outspoken guy. And as you listen to the episode, you will hear it. The topic of this conversation is hedge funds, so general investing and vetting hedge funds, and he has a lot of experience there. And number 3 that I picked for this conversation was episode number 28 with my friend Otavio Costa, who is a partner now. He was an analyst, I think, or an associate back when I spoke to him, but he now is a partner at Crescent Capital, which is a hedge fund down in Denver, Colorado. And we talk about global macro investing, and it's just amazing to see how much effort they put into coming up with their ideas, and the very thought-provoking ideas. And he posts a lot on social media. He's been on many different platforms, and his charts are all shown on the Wall Street Lab every once in a while. So that was a great pleasure for me, not only as a host of a podcast, but also to see that a friend of mine who I've known since college days has been doing so well. So those are my 3. Andy, do you wanna go into your 3 most favorite episodes?
Do you think it has anything to do with our podcast that Tavi got promoted to partner? I think so. I would say being on our podcast really helps your profile, doesn't it?
I think so. I should ask. Maybe we should ask him for a donation or something.
Better don't ask, because I already am sure that we basically are responsible for his success. So let me talk about my, I wouldn't say favorite episodes, because honestly, all my guests, all your guests were my favorites. But I just want to point out some of them, because all our guests have been amazing and really interesting. A cool episode for myself was with Daniel Crosby about behavioral finance. He's just a really fun guy to talk to, and I learned a lot for myself personally in the behavior that I do and I see in investing. And he's also going ahead a bit, some great books on behavioral finance. So if you guys want to check that out. One of my other favorite episodes was Dan Rasmussen. He talked about disrupting private equity in episode 29. And what I liked about the episode is that it's very contrarian. It's not the typical private equity is the hype. It's just a very different view on the industry, and that was really got me thinking. And for everybody that wants to start lightly, and it's been just a big fun recording it, is episode 39 with Markus Koch. He's just such a fun guy. He talks about stories that drive Wall Street. It's not too technical. It's a light, cool, easy way to start off. So that's my recommendations to start, but honestly, just pick any episodes, and I hope you would love it.
I agree. On my end, I would mention 2 that really are the ones that I often go back to, especially the first one I'm going to mention, because it was just released so long ago, but I keep going back to it from time to time and just listening to it. It's been just brilliant, and it's the episode number 4 with Brian Tomlinson, who was at the time a global fixed income portfolio manager at Allianz Global Investors, and it's just brilliant. I still remember recording this episode. So when Leo was interviewing Brian, I remember being in the room when we were recording it. It's I think another fun story of its own how this recording happened, but we might leave that for the 100 episode special. In any case, number 4 really I think number 1 that we've done so far. It's been amazing. The story of Brexit. It was I think it was just after Brexit happened. His approach. He was telling us about like how his approach was to this problem. And then my second episode I want to mention is one of the more recent episodes. It's episode number 48 with Howard Marks. I believe Howard Marks does not need an introduction. I was just amazed that someone like this would come on the podcast and speak to us. It's been a great episode, and him telling stories of his approach to the financial crisis and to investing is great.
I think we all would have picked that one if we could, but like we wanted to keep it a bit diverse.
Yes, probably. Yeah, so this has been, I think all of the episodes were great, and the guest that we had did an amazing job. We also try to keep a very high quality of the episodes that we're releasing. So now maybe a little bit of some, I would call it a carve out section where we talk about our favorite resources, books, podcasts, anything else that we'd like to mention. Why don't we jump into this? Leo, why don't we start off with some books and other podcasts that you could recommend to our listeners that might influence the way of thinking, or some books or podcasts that had a big impact on you and your career, your life?
I wrote a few of these down, but I will go ahead and talk about one book that's not on my list actually, but has nothing to do with finance really. And it was the autobiography of Andre Agassi, the tennis player, former world number one. If I'm not mistaken, that was the very first audiobook that I purchased back maybe 4 years ago, even longer. Well, 5 years ago. And it's such an honest description of his career, his ups and downs. He's very honest about his struggles, the fact that he actually did not choose his career as a tennis player. The career was chosen for him as his father started coaching him very early on. So that was incredible. Other than that, if you want something more finance related, I would say anything by Taleb, anything by Michael Lewis, Malcolm Gladwell, and of course one of the latest ones that I read by Howard Marks, and it was his first book, The Most Important Thing. He's written another book after that, but The Most Important Thing for me, if you were to, I typically read my books on my Kindle, and I try to, highlight sections of my book so I have access to them later. If you look at my highlights on this book, it's almost every page because he condensed so much information into a relatively small book. So anyone interested in investing and his philosophy, most importantly, how he thinks about being a contrarian, I think that's a very good one. And I don't want to take too much time, but I will just talk about the podcasts because you asked. Some finance-related podcasts that I've listened and I constantly listen to are Capital Allocators, Masters in Business, Invest Like the Best, Recode, Decode. Tim Ferriss is one that we've been listening to for quite some time. And one that has nothing to do with finance or business or self-development or anything like that is the podcast by Conan O'Brien. Conan O'Brien Needs a Friend, which is hilarious. Anything that would like to a lighter listen, something that you'd listen to before you go to bed if you're by yourself, because if you have your husband or wife, boyfriend or girlfriend next to you, they might complain for the laughs because it's really funny, so I'd recommend that one. So that's all I have before it gets too much. Andy, do you want to go on?
Yeah, sure. Read everything by Taleb. His books are amazing, and for the books I would recommend divide them into different categories, let's say. Of the first category is like anything related to management, leading people, and I would recommend $1 Trillion Coach, which is a really cool book written by the former Google CEO. Then more personal books that I would recommend is The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People. It's a really good book to get your life together a bit, honestly. And one book I've been recommending to Luke, actually, because I know how little he sleeps sometimes, I recommend him Why We Sleep by Matthew Walker, and it's really insightful. It blew my mind. And the last book honestly started to re-listen again a couple of days ago is Principles by Ray Dalio, and that's a finance-related book. I hope one day we get Ray Dalio on the podcast. So that's my big goal. Ray, if you're listening, reach out. If anybody knows Ray, also reach out. Right, I would love to get in touch.
Andy, I'm sure he's listening to this right now.
Absolutely. I mean, after knowing that Tavi got partner for being on the podcast, I think it can only go up, right? And yeah, before I forget, podcast, Tim Ferriss podcast I love the show, love how he digs in with all those world famous people. And one smaller podcast that is really cool, that really changed the way I think, is the Naval podcast. And he talks about how to get rich without getting lucky. Really cool thing. Now, Luke, I'm curious to see what you have for us.
So definitely the book that you recommended me, the Why We Sleep. I actually found it. I started listening to it. I remember that author was telling us, because I listen to audiobooks mostly, was telling us about how he even appreciates if we listen to the book before we sleep, for several reasons. Unfortunately for me, I kept falling asleep, so I'm still working on this one. However, so a few things I've read recently that I've really enjoyed, maybe a little bit less finance but more relating to, I think, entrepreneurship. One book that in particular I would like to mention is a very known book, but for some reason I've never had a chance to read it before. I read it just last year. It's The Hard Things About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz, and it's amazing because most of the books, when you start digging through business books, you're going to find that every book in business talks about good times, how to manage people, how to operate when everything is going well. And this is a special book because this book tells you about what happens when everything is going wrong. And if you're an entrepreneur, you're going to see that every day there are things that you need to deal with. Every day brings new challenges. This is just something that for me was very interesting to see. It's different than all of the regular management books that you get into that tell you only about the good times. Another book is completely non-finance related, but something I really much enjoyed. It's the book called Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. You might know what the book is referring to. It's a story of this individual, David Goggins, who's just essentially indestructible. I would highly recommend getting into it. He also, by following him on Instagram, he motivates me a lot always to go to the gym. So that's something completely on the side. But I'm sure this also is a kind of a motivational story, because as much as I avoid motivational speakers and coaching and all of these things, this guy seems to be the real deal. So it's very interesting to see and to read about his story. And then the third one would be also quite interesting book by John, I don't want to mispronounce the name, Carreyrou. Please, I'm bad at this. The book is called Bad Blood. It's the story of Silicon Valley startup Theranos. I'm sure everyone has heard what happened there. It's a very detailed kind of account of what was going on. Just very interesting read and deep dive. When we come to podcasts, I'm also a little bit more so I'm in between finance and tech all the time. So I think these are very specific ones. So one of my favorite ones recently is Acquired, where they pretty much analyze all of the IPOs and M&A in the tech industry, both from the investment banking and essentially the tech side of the deals that happened. For general technology, I love listening to the Vergecast, just general banter about tech coming out every week. Really fun guys sitting down and talking about what happened last week in tech. Then, of course, as everyone else, I love Joe Rogan. And if you want to deep dive into some more AI topics, which I'm really interested in, so probably the best resource for that is the AI with Lex Friedman, I think formerly from MIT. Really, really good deep dive, great guests, and you can learn a lot because he jumps from very open questions to very specific questions that deep dive into different structures and models and things like that. Yeah, that'll be on the podcast end. I think we can talk maybe a little bit more about some other resources that might be helpful for listeners. Leo, you want to jump in on some things here?
Other resources that I listen to or read frequently for my day job. One is the memos by Howard Marks. They are always very insightful and free. So if you go to Oaktree Capital, I think at Insight, you can find them all there, and you can actually sign up to his newsletter. So whenever he writes something new, you get one in your mailbox, which is always very helpful. I didn't realize that he actually coined the phrase, "you can't eat IRR." Everyone says you can't eat IRR, but you don't know who actually coined that phrase. And that was one of the titles of one of his memos. So that was interesting to know. And by the way, if you read that memo, you will have a different understanding of actually what IRR means. But anyway, that's a side note. The other one that I would point to is Matt Levine's daily articles. Matt Levine from Bloomberg, and his articles are just so on point, so well researched. He knows a lot. He used to be an investment banker at Goldman Sachs, and how he writes articles for Bloomberg. His articles are read by a lot of people in the industry. He's well respected. He's very funny. And you always, every day, if you have the time, and if you take the time to read it, you always learn something new. So I would highly recommend his articles for anyone interested in finance. And the last one that I wanted to mention is very much focused on what I do on my day job, and it has to do with real estate. I mostly spend my time vetting fund managers on the real estate side. When you're in a position as an allocator, you always wonder what skill set you need to become better at what you do. It would be valuable for you to acquire some skills that you don't necessarily need for your daily job, but that is necessary if you are on the sponsor side of the business, if you're fund manager, so that you can have a deeper conversation about what deals they're looking at, what assumptions they're taking, be able to ask the right questions, know when they're being aggressive on their assumptions. So I started an online course on financial modeling. I've dabbled with it for many years. I mean, I don't consider myself a beginner there, but I've never had a formal education on that. So I decided to sign up for a course on real estate financial modeling, adventures in commercial real estate, adventures in CRE. And they, by the way, they're not sponsoring this episode in any way, so you're welcome. But it's been very good. I enjoy it. It starts very basic, which is good so that everyone is on the same page, and then it gets deeper and more interesting as time goes by. So I haven't finished it. I'm not even close to finishing it, but so far so good. Those are the three that I would recommend if you're interested in these topics. Go check them out.
Awesome. From my side, I think what I would add here, I think quarantine is a good time for education in general, and you have access to so many things right now. I'm a huge fan of online learning, so this is why actually I'm drinking coffee instead of wine with you guys, because I have to continue studying for my courses. Of course, I think it's very important to continue learning as you go, because the access to everything is so open. And I've recently made a LinkedIn post about online education resources that I've been doing for several years now, that I've been using different platforms. So for those of you who are interested in learning something more, I'm personally doing things mostly related to tech, programming, machine learning, and AI. If you want to work in a very specific finance field, I think knowledge of things like Python and several other languages and tools are becoming sometimes even a requirement for work in finance in specific fields. So from my side, what I could recommend for jumping into the topic, first of all, I think my favorite, and none of these are sponsored as well, by the way, my favorite one that I've been using is Udacity. They have just very specific tech learning courses. They offer nano degrees, which is great. They deep dive into a very specific topic, and even have some financial focused programming and tech courses. Second one I would like to mention is MIT OpenCourseWare, which is pretty much just simply free recorded classes from MIT, so no sign up, no account. It's a great initiative, especially if you're doing computer science classes, if you want to listen in. However, it does require a lot of patience and commitment, because nobody is checking up on your assignments or anything. You have to be really committed to work together with the class if you're following this. Then there is Coursera, which is probably the go-to for most people, because you can find courses from a lot of great universities and just pick those up. Either, I'm not sure if for free or for very little, because it varies whether you want a certificate or not, and different universities offer different courses, and you can also do full online degrees as well, which is great. Then there is Code Academy, which is awesome for just learning individual tech skills, I would say, especially whenever I want to learn a new language or recall a syntax for a specific language that I haven't been using for a really long time. I go there and do some practice exercises. It's great. And then for data science, Data Camp is probably the one if you want to deep dive into data science things. So these are a few that I really appreciate and I think are really great.
I have a question for you. I've asked myself that question many times, and it's always interesting to hear different opinions on what language you would recommend people in our industry to start if they don't have a computer science background. What would you say to someone who would like to get into programming or data science?
Especially in finance, I would say the two basics that you could go with are Python and R. And the reason for that is that these are the two, I believe, most commonly used languages for any data science tasks. And Python is very often connected to or used for applications in the financial industry. It's actually quite easy in comparison to others to learn, and its specific use is kind of directed towards financial industry, I would say. So I would start there if you're looking for essentially to combine your financial background with programming. This is a great way to start, and both of them I would personally recommend starting with Python and then getting into R, but people have of course different opinions on these things. But Python is a really good starting point for anyone. If you are familiar with financial modeling and things like that, when you start learning programming, you will see probably a lot of similarities. Of course, it's more complex, but you will be able to connect the dots and get it more easily, I would say. Yeah, and all of the really platforms that I mentioned previously are good starting points for anyone who would like to deep dive into this. Even if we're talking about things like machine learning, diving more deeply, Python is still one of the core languages that you should know for this. So you cannot go wrong with learning Python. Andy, do you have any carve-outs for us?
Honestly, I feel a bit put on the spot here, and I don't even want to talk anymore because you guys are seeming to do so much, and I just got my explanation why I've been having so much time for the podcast, because apparently I've been neglecting my education, but I want to change that, and that's why I signed up for the Kaya, because thanks to Luke, who pointed me in the direction of Kaya, because he said if you are a CFA charter holder, you can directly sign up for level 2. And I was like, oh, well, I can skip one level and go directly to the finish line. That sounds pretty good. So I'll try that. Honestly, I want to bring up a topic because you've both talked about it, and people may be asking themselves, yeah, you guys tell me you have so little time, but apparently all you do is like listening to audiobooks, listening to podcasts, and doing some online courses, which is absolutely not true. I would love to tell our listeners what both of you are doing. So, Leo, you said you are an allocator. Can you give us just a bit more detail on what you're doing. What is your day job?
To be fair, I typically don't like to talk about what I do on my day job very much because a lot of what we do in a family office is very confidential. So, but I can certainly tell you generally what it is. So I work for a family office, as I said, investing on behalf of Hasso Plattner, who was one of the co-founders of SAP, the German enterprise software company. We invest for him, a few family members, and also the Hasso Plattner Foundation. We're a typical allocator. We like to say that we follow the endowment model. We spend our days looking for talent worldwide. I focus specific on real estate. I've been there for almost 3 years now. I very much enjoy it. It's challenging. Every day something new. So yeah, that's what I've been doing when I'm not doing this or playing with my daughter or spending time with my wife. So,
Luke, and what keeps you busy?
I think in some previous episodes, maybe we mentioned a little bit about what we do. So my background is I've studied economics and finance, and then currently I'm also learning a lot in the machine learning and AI space. I've previously worked together with Leo in private equity and venture for a few years, and then afterwards I became an entrepreneur. I co-founded a blockchain asset management company, and afterwards also co-founded another company in the PropTech space, a software as a service company developing digital solutions for property management. So always somewhere on the verge of fintech and technology. It's kind of where I feel most comfortable. Not to forget about our podcast, which is also a significant part of my life. I think, Andy, why don't you also tell us about what you do on a daily basis and what takes your time outside of the podcast?
I don't think it's just that interesting as the two of you have, but I'm the director of new business and accounts for a German startup, which basically means that I talk to prospective clients and partners and just try to figure out how fintech solutions could help their business. I spend a lot of time talking to banks, asset managers, private banks, and try to see where are the trends in digitalization in the financial industry that basically keeps me busy aside from the podcast and not doing any other outside studies.
I'm sure the Kaya will keep you busy over the next few months.
I'm pretty sure.
Yeah. Do we want to talk a little bit about Andy? Maybe you can say a few words about, because I know you have a lot planned for the listeners. You want to give a very small teaser of what to expect in the next weeks?
Aside from Ray Dalio, of course, if you're listening, it's still open. I actually have also a book recommendation that I am taking now. It's The Man Who Solved the Market. It's a book about Jim Simons, and I had the pleasure to interview the author, Greg Zuckerman. So he's going to be on the show soon.
Loved the book.
I'm glad you do. I hope our listeners do listen to it before the episode or afterwards, latest. One of the topics that personally I really get into lately and I really love on a personal basis is sustainable and impact investing. So I will have some episodes scheduled, or I have some episodes scheduled with big names in the industry. So be excited for that. I think this is a good update. And honestly, if anybody of our listeners, if you have recommendations, please do reach out, tell us, and we will try to look into it.
Definitely. And I'm trying to bring someone who's handling the technology side of the investment industry to deep dive a little bit more with a potential CTO of a financial company to tell you a little bit more about that. I find it super interesting, and we'll try to deep dive into this a little bit more.
And on my side, I realize that we've done 50 episodes and we've never had an episode on real estate. Which is interesting, given that's what I do every day. I've recorded a couple of interviews with some very smart guests. One of them is Brad Case. He's an economist and very insightful, especially when it comes to the connection between public and private real estate markets, how the two are interconnected. So that was a very interesting conversation, very eye-opening for me. And the other one was with Paul Kaysberg. who works at a multifamily real estate manager in San Diego, California, and he's written a book that was also very eye-opening. And I mean, I realize, and any of you who is in the real estate industry, if you look for books to read in real estate, and if you just Google it, typically you'll find very salesy titles: get rich, buy, flip houses and become a millionaire tomorrow kind of titles. And he wrote a very interesting book, very much focused on diligencing deals and sponsors. So that was an interesting conversation that will be probably coming out within the next month or so, depending on how many interviews Andy keeps doing. So
actually, guys, I wanted to talk with you about this. I think our listeners should hopefully agree, and I've put you on the spot with this, that I suggest we release weekly because we have a lot of episodes. Just want to tell, in case we end up doing this, we might have to go back because now you all know we are super busy in our day lives. But enjoy it while it lasts. And the cool thing is I don't want to say the cool thing about Corona, but one of the few positive side effects is that people seem to be home now a lot, so they have more time at hand, and that's really good for us. One really funny thing that Luke sent us the other day is, did you know that podcast mics are sold out on Amazon? And I think you know that shit is really bad if podcast mics are sold out. So please stick with us. Don't go too far astray and keep supporting us because we've been there for you always.
Good that we have a good mic supply going on, so we should be fine, and we can continue recording episodes and building up the Wall Street Lab knowledge base that we have going on. So with that in mind, guys, we really appreciate each and every one of you who are tuning in the podcast. Please, if you have suggestions, if you have people who you would like to see on the podcast, any comments, just feel free to reach out, write us. Probably LinkedIn is the best place. Just mention that you come from the podcast, and we are happy to talk to you. I think we got to the end at this point. Any last thoughts, guys?
What I would say to anyone, and I don't know this for a fact, but I think that most people who listen to this episode are in their 20s or 30s, so early in their careers. What I would say from my personal experience is that this podcast has broadened my perspective. It has allowed me to not be just focused on one thing and getting perspectives from different people, learning about different areas of finance. So what I can say is, anyone who's listening to this, go out and create your own podcast. Be a competitor because you learn so much out of it. There's just good that comes out of it. Of course, it's not without its sacrifices. There is a lot of work that goes into it, and I think it's getting easier by the minute. The technologies are getting easier. The way that you can upload is getting easier. You can outsource parts of it, and we're happy to give you some tips if you plan to do your own. But I find this to be such a great resource for anyone who wants to network, anyone who wants to learn from the very best. I mean, think about talking to Howard Marks. I mean, when in the world will we have the chance to speak to such a legend, really? Go out and create your own podcast. We will be honored if you one day in 10 years from now and you have a successful podcast and you say, hey, I started my podcast because the guys at the Wall Street Lab encouraged me to. We'll be happy for that. So, yeah.
Mention us on Twitter when you do that. Also, we could not end this podcast with any other words of appreciation towards everyone who got to the end of this podcast. So if you're still listening, to the two people still listening, thank you a lot. And we hope to bring you many more episodes. And if this episode works out, if you like this episode, maybe we can do more of this in the future. Just a little bit more structured, probably, as we learn out of this experience. Let's see. Please
keep up the cool stories you're sending us. We've had many cool things, and I hope that everybody of you is going to be successful. We really do appreciate everybody that writes us, even though we can't show it always. Thank you very much, and really go on your path, be out there, and keep up doing the amazing things you do.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone. That's been the random show. Have a good day.
Bye.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to the Wall Street Lab podcast. For the show notes and much more, visit us at www.thewallstreetlab.com. To see what we're up to before anyone else, subscribe to our newsletter on our website and follow us on Facebook and Twitter.
Disclaimer. Information contained in this podcast constitutes the opinions of individuals and should not be treated as investment, tax, financial, or legal advice. We take no responsibility for the accuracy of any statements made in this podcast. This podcast is for informational and educational purposes only, and it does not contain an offer to sell or buy any sort of financial products, and should not be treated as advertisement for such. Any copying, distribution, or reproduction of this podcast without the prior permission of the creators of the podcast is strictly prohibited.